The ground was still damp in the pre-dawn light of May 16, 1777. The location was a pasture near Savannah, Georgia, a quiet clearing just south of the Colonial Park Cemetery. This place, euphemistically called the Field of Honor, was not a battlefield of the ongoing war, but something else, a cold, formal stage for a personal ritual. This was a place where two men would meet to settle a matter of reputation, armed with pistols and a rigid, unyielding code. Two men arrived separately, each accompanied by a second, a trusted associate who would manage the grim proceedings. The first was Button Gwinnett, an English-born merchant who had risen quickly in Georgia's revolutionary government. His name was not obscure. He was a statesman, a patriot, and, most significantly, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He had pledged his life, fortune, and sacred honor for the new nation less than a year prior. The second man was General Lachlan McIntosh, a distinguished and respected military officer born of a prominent Scottish Highland family that had helped settle the colony. This was not a brawl. It was a formal, almost legalistic procedure. The seconds, George Wells for Gwinnett, Joseph Habersham for McIntosh, conferred. General McIntosh, as the challenged party, provided the weapons, a pair of dueling pistols. They were loaded with a single lead ball each. The seconds measured the distance, 12 paces. It was a horrifyingly close range, a distance at which missing was difficult. The two men, Gwinnett and McIntosh, took their positions. They were two of the most powerful men in the state, a statesman who signed the nation's founding document and a general who defended it. Now they stood just yards apart, pistols in hand, prepared to end the other's life over a question of honor. The command was given. In the quiet of the morning, two shots cracked, echoing almost as one. Both men were struck. The code duello, the set of rules governing these affairs, had been followed perfectly. General McIntosh was hit in the leg. Button Gwinnett was struck in the thigh, a severe wound that caused him to collapse to the ground. What happened next demonstrates the bizarre, counterintuitive nature of the code. McIntosh, still standing despite his own injury, asked Gwinnett if he wished for another shot. Gwinnett, from the ground, agreed, if only he could be helped to his feet. They were both willing to continue, but the seconds intervened. They declared that both men's honor had been demonstrated. The primary objective of the duel had been met. It was not necessarily to end a life, but to publicly demonstrate that both men were willing to risk their lives for their reputations. With honor now satisfied, the two rivals, both bleeding, shook hands. The ritual was complete. General McIntosh was taken from the field, his wound serious but not life-threatening. Button Gwinnett was also carried away. The handshake, the declaration of satisfied honor, it all proved meaningless against the reality of the injury. While McIntosh recovered, Gwinnett did not. The wound was fatal. The signer of the Declaration of Independence died several days later on May 19, 1777. He was one of the first of the nation's founders to fall, not at the hands of the British, but at the hands of a fellow patriot on a dueling ground. But this fatal encounter was not the beginning of the story, but the end of a bitter personal and professional feud. To understand how two patriots could be driven to this, we must go back. The duel that claimed Button Gwinnett's life was the violent culmination of a bitter political dispute. In the midst of the Revolutionary War, the new state of Georgia was in chaos, its government unstable. Into this power vacuum stepped two ambitious and powerful men, Gwinnett and Lachlan McIntosh. Gwinnett, though a lesser-known figure in the grand scheme of the founding, was a man of quick ambition. McIntosh was a firm supporter of American rights, a career military man from an established family, commissioned as a colonel in the Continental Army. Their personalities and jurisdictions were destined to clash. The flashpoint for their feud was a disaster, a failed military expedition against British-held East Florida in April 1777. A letter from Lyman Hall, Another declaration signer details the internal conflict. Gwinnett, as president and commander-in-chief of the Georgia militia, saw himself as the principal leader and commander of the entire operation. He traveled to Sunbury and summoned the Continental troops, commanded by General McIntosh, to join him. McIntosh, however, a professional soldier, balked at taking orders from the civilian Gwinnett. When Gwinnett summoned a council of war, McIntosh would not hold a council of war with him. The chain of command, so new and fragile in the young republic, broke down completely. The expedition fell apart, and both men returned to Savannah, each blaming the other for the humiliating defeat. This professional rivalry quickly turned personal and vindictive. Gwinnett, wielding his civilian authority, launched an investigation not just into the expedition, but into General McIntosh's family. He targeted Lachlan's brother, George McIntosh, accusing him of treason. In a shocking move that bypassed the governing council, Gwinnett caused said George McIntosh to be taken prisoner and put in the common jail. To compound the insult, he ordered him to have iron handcuffs on. This was a direct and deeply personal attack on the McIntosh family honor. Gwinnett had arrested his rival's brother, and he was now investigating the general himself. The entire contention was brought before the Georgia Assembly for an inquiry. Both men appeared and were heard. The Assembly, divided along factional lines, ultimately passed a resolution that approved of the conduct of Mr. Gwinnett and his council. For General McIntosh, this was the final intolerable insult. He had been professionally undermined, his brother was in jail, and now his rival had been publicly vindicated by the government. The tension broke on May 15, 1777. At that assembly meeting, General McIntosh, his honor impugned and his family attacked, publicly denounced Gwinnett. With Gwinnett himself present in the room, McIntosh ridiculed his leadership and, according to Lyman Hall's letter and other accounts, called him scoundrel and lying rascal. In the 18th century, these were not mere words. They were a public, formal accusation of deep, personal dishonor. To be called a scoundrel and a rascal in front of one's peers was an insult that the code of honor could not ignore. Button Gwinnett, outraged, acted immediately. Later that same evening, he penned a formal, written challenge and had it delivered to General McIntosh, demanding a duel. McIntosh, having delivered the public insult, had no choice but to accept. The challenge was sent. The acceptance was returned. The field of honor was the only remaining recourse. This code of honor, which cost one of the nation's founders his life, was not unique to Georgia. Decades later, in New York, that same rigid code would reappear, claiming the life of another promising young man. The story moves forward decades, to New York and to another family of the American Revolution. Philip Hamilton was born on January 22, 1782, the eldest son of Alexander Hamilton and Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. From his first moments, this child was not just a son, but an heir to a legacy, weighed down by immense, almost burdensome expectations. His father, Alexander, the first Secretary of the Treasury, was one of the nation's most brilliant and controversial figures. Philip was his proudest hope for the future. Alexander Hamilton's letters are filled with this pride. When Philip was just 7 months old, his father wrote playfully to a friend, "He has a method of waving his hand that announces the future orator." He was, in his father's eyes, a very fine young gentleman, remarkable for his intelligence and sweetness of temper. As Philip grew, he proved to be intelligent and charming. But he also inherited other, more dangerous traits from his father, a rakish streak, and most critically a powerful, perhaps reckless sense of personal honor. Alexander wanted a worthy heir, and he was molding Philip in his own image. After Philip graduated with honors from his father's alma mater, Columbia College, he began to study law, following directly in Alexander's footsteps. At this point, Alexander's guidance became an iron grip. He was determined to control every aspect of Philip's schedule, drafting a document titled Rules for Mr. Philip Hamilton. This text, which survives today, provides a stunning window into the father's obsessive project. The rules were a rigorous minute-by-minute plan for cognitive calisthenics. The script will detail this schedule to show the level of control. From the 1st of April to the 1st of October, Hamilton wrote, he is to rise not later than 6 o'clock, the rest of the year not later than 7. From the moment he was dressed till 9 o'clock, the time for breakfast excepted, he is to read law. At 9, he was to go to the law office where he would remain till dinner time. After dinner, he reads law at home till 5 o'clock. His evenings were just as structured. From 7 to 10, he reads and studies whatever he pleases. Hamilton concluded, he must not depart from any of these rules without my permission. This schedule reveals a son who was not just being guided, he was being forged. His life was a project, designed by his father to create a great lawyer and statesman. This intense psychological molding created a son who was not just loyal, but an extension of his father's own ego. This deep, close relationship and the immense pressure of his father's expectations are the keys to understanding why Philip, at age 19, felt such an eagerness to defend his father's name. The antagonist who would test that defense soon appeared. He was George Thurse Aker, a 27-year-old New York lawyer. Aker was a Democratic Republican, a political opponent of Alexander, Hamilton, and a known supporter of his chief rival, Aaron Burr. On July 4, 1801, Aker was chosen to give a public oration. In this speech, he launched a public and severe attack, not on Philip, but on his father. Aker accused Alexander Hamilton of misusing his recent position as Inspector General of the Army. He suggested that Hamilton wanted to use the U.S. Army to intimidate political opponents, and, most gravely, that Hamilton was a man who would not be opposed to overthrow Thomas Jefferson's presidency by force. This was the scoundrel and a lying rascal moment for the next generation. Aker had, in a public forum, accused Alexander Hamilton of being a military-minded threat to the Republic. For Philip, the eldest and brightest hope, the son molded by the rules to be his father's proxy, this was an intolerable public stain on the Hamilton name. 4 months later, that speech would be brought up again in a public place. And just like in Georgia, a public insult would demand a public and dangerous response. On the evening of November 20th, 1801, the 19-year-old Philip Hamilton and his friend Richard Price attended a performance of a comedy at the Park Theater in Manhattan. This was not a private function, but a public gathering. During the event, they spotted the 27-year-old lawyer, George Aker, in a nearby box. This was the man who, 4 months earlier, had publicly accused Philip's father of being a potential military despot. Still burning with the need to defend his father's name, Philip and Price stormed Aker's box at the theater and began to insult him, confronting him about the July 4th speech. An angry confrontation erupted, spilling out of the box and into the lobby. Cornered and insulted by the two younger men, Aker responded with a single, explosive phrase. He called Philip and Price damned rascals. That word, rascals, was the trigger. Just as scoundrel had been for Gwinnett, this was an insult that, according to the 18th century Code of Honor, could not be left unanswered. The Code of Honor was immediately invoked. Both young men, Price and Philip, challenged Aker to separate duels. Dueling was already illegal in New York, so the men agreed to meet across the Hudson River in New Jersey. The chosen site was the infamous dueling grounds at Weehawken, a secluded ledge under the cliffs, hidden from the law. What is often forgotten is that there were 2 duels. On November 22, 1801, George Aker met Richard Price at Weehawken. They took their positions, and shots were exchanged. Some accounts suggest as many as 4 shots were fired in total. but no one was injured. According to the strange conventions of the code, honor was satisfied. The two men, having proven their courage, were reconciled. This bloodless encounter is crucial. It demonstrates that Acre was not necessarily a cold-blooded marksman, and it shows that these affairs could end harmlessly. It makes the tragedy of the following day even more profound. On November 23rd, it was Philip Hamilton's turn. By this time, his father, Alexander, had learned of the impending duel. Horrified, he commanded his son, when on the ground, to reserve his fire till after Mr. E had shot and then to discharge his pistol in the air. This practice, known as a delope E, was an attempt to satisfy the ritual of the code, appearing on the field, without engaging in its violence. It was a father's desperate attempt to reconcile his son's honor with his son's life. Philip arrived at Weehawken, equipped with a set of ornate pistols. These pistols were not his own. They belonged to his uncle, Alexander Hamilton's brother-in-law, John Barker Church. This is the first critical fatal link in a chain of tragedy. Philip and Acre took their positions. The command to present was given, and then, for an agonizing minute, nothing happened. Both men stood shotless. Philip, following his father's command, refused to raise his pistol to fire. Acre, perhaps, recalling his harmless duel the day before, also hesitated. For one long, silent minute, the two men stood, trapped by a code, neither willing to be the first to shoot. Finally, after this terrible pause, Acre raised his pistol. Philip, seeing this, did the same. Acre fired first. Philip was felled, struck by the ball. As he fell to the ground, his own pistol discharged, the shot going awry. Harmless. Alexander Hamilton's advice, intended to save his son, had been a fatal miscalculation. By commanding Philip to wait, he had inadvertently given Acre the choice. Acre, facing a 19-year-old opponent whose intentions he could not know, did not wait. The father's attempt to subvert the code had, in its rigidity, made his son a target. Philip Hamilton fell to a ball from Acre's dueling pistol. He was carried from the field back across the river to his aunt's home. His father was sent for. When Alexander Hamilton learned that his son had been wounded, he rushed to the home of Dr. David Hosack, the family physician and a friend to both Hamilton and his rival, Aaron Burr. When he arrived, he was told that Dr. Hosack, having already heard the news, had left for the home of John and Angelica Church, Philip's aunt and uncle, where the wounded 19-year-old had been taken. What happened next, recorded in Dr. Hosack's own account, reveals the true depth of the father's shock. Alexander Hamilton, the formidable general and statesman, the man of intellect and rules, was so much overcome by his anxiety that he fainted. He collapsed in the doctor's home and remained some time before he was sufficiently recovered to proceed. The man who had faced battlefield cannons was undone by the agony of grief for his son. Upon recovering, Hamilton hurried to the church home. There he found his son. A witness described the scene. On a bed without curtains lay poor Phil, pale and languid, his rolling, distorted eyeballs darting forth the flashes of delirium. Hamilton, the father, approached the bed. He observed the pale and ashen appearance of Philip's face and tested his pulse. It was in this moment that the father's composure, so carefully rebuilt after his collapse, broke entirely. According to Dr. Hosack, who was now present, Hamilton instantly turned from the bed and, taking me by the hand, which he grasped with all the agony of grief, he exclaimed in a tone and manner that can never be effaced from my memory, "Doctor, I despair." This was the cry of a man watching his proudest hope, the eldest and brightest hope of my family, extinguished before his eyes. This was the total and complete collapse of the future he had so meticulously planned. Philip's mother, Elizabeth, who was 3 months pregnant at the time, was also sent for. Alexander and Elizabeth stayed beside Philip through the night, a long, agonizing vigil. Philip Hamilton died at 5:40 a.m. on November 24, 1801, 14 hours after the initial wound. He was 19 years old. The aftermath was one of utter devastation. At the burial, Alexander Hamilton, the man of such towering strength, could barely stand. He had to be held up by friends and family as he approached his son's grave. One friend, Robert Troup, observed in a letter, "Never did I see a man so completely overwhelmed with grief as Hamilton had been." The father plunged into a state of grief from which he never fully recovered. But Philip was not the only casualty of that day. The tragedy had another living victim, Philip's 17-year-old sister, Angelica Hamilton. The two siblings had been very close. Upon learning of her brother's death, Angelica suffered a mental breakdown from which she never recovered. Her mental state deteriorated until she became only intermittently lucid. She sometimes could not even recognize family members. For the rest of her long life, Angelica remained in a state described as eternal childhood, often talking to her brother Philip as if he were still alive. For 3 years, Alexander Hamilton would live in a home with this constant, heartbreaking reminder of the catastrophic cost of the dueling code. It was not just a memory of grief, it was a permanent daily trauma. For 3 years, Alexander Hamilton lived with this grief. He lived in the house with his daughter, Angelica, and he lived with the knowledge of the code that had taken his son. Then, in 1804, that same code came for him. Alexander Hamilton's final affair of honor was with Aaron Burr, the sitting Vice President of the United States. Theirs was not a new disagreement, but a long-lived political and personal battle that had spanned decades. While their rivalry was famously political, it was also deeply professional. Both were titans of the New York legal world, often finding themselves dueling each other from opposite sides of the courtroom. A prime example of their professional animosity, separate from electoral politics, was the affair of the Manhattan Company in 1799. At the time, Hamilton's allies controlled the New York banking system. The Bank of New York was the only major bank in the city. Aaron Burr, needing capital for his own ventures and allies, sought to create a rival bank. Knowing the Federalist-controlled legislature would never approve a Republican bank, Burr devised an ingenious Trojan horse. He lobbied for a charter to create the Manhattan Company, a private corporation with the public-facing goal of bringing pure and wholesome water to the city to combat yellow fever. Burr duped the legislature and even Hamilton himself, who was an initial founder, by hiding a seemingly innocuous amendment deep in the charter. This clause allowed the company to use any surplus capital for banking operations. The water project was a front. The bank was the real prize. Burr's betrayal worked, and he successfully broke Hamilton's financial monopoly. This was the kind of long-standing personal animosity that defined their relationship. The final flashpoint came in 1804. After Burr lost the election for governor of New York, a race in which Hamilton had ardently opposed him, a newspaper clipping came to Burr's attention. It contained a letter from a Dr. Charles D. Cooper. Cooper's letter mentioned that Hamilton had called Burr a dangerous man, and one who ought not to be trusted. But it also referenced a still more despicable opinion that Hamilton had expressed. This was the vague, public insult Burr needed. He immediately sent a letter to Hamilton, delivered by his second, William P. Van Ness. He demanded a prompt and unqualified acknowledgement or denial of the phrase. Hamilton, in his reply, refused. He argued that the term despicable was vague and that he could not, on principle, consent to be interrogated about his political opponent in the course of a 15 years competition. After 10 days of tense, escalating correspondence, an impasse was reached. A formal challenge was issued. Hamilton accepted. In a statement he left behind, he wrote that while he was strongly opposed to the practice, he felt it was not possible to avoid the duel, without sacrifices which would have rendered me unworthy of your esteem. His son had died for his honor. His daughter's mind was broken by it, and now Hamilton, a man overwhelmed with grief, felt he too must answer its call. The duel was set for dawn, July 11, 1804. The parallels to his son's fate are exact and chilling. First, the spot. They met at Weehawken, New Jersey. It was close to the spot where his son, Philip Hamilton, was fatally wounded 3 years prior. Second, the pistols. As the challenged party, Hamilton had the right to select the weapons. He chose the exact same set of ornate dueling pistols belonging to his brother-in-law, John Barker Church, the very ones Philip had used. The men stood at their paces. Hamilton's shot went high, striking a tree branch above and behind Burr's head. Burr's shot did not. Hamilton was struck in the abdomen and collapsed, gasping, "I am a dead man." Dr. David Hosack, the same physician who had attended Philip, was there. He rushed to Hamilton's side. The dying man looked at him and said, "This is a mortal wound, doctor." Hamilton was rowed back across the river, not to his aunt's home, but to the home of his friend William Bayard. His wife Eliza and their children were sent for. He died the following day, July 12, 1804, after a long vigil, just as his son had. Dr. Hosack performed the autopsy. The ball had broken a rib, passed through his liver and diaphragm, and finally lodged against his spine. A U.S. founding father, killed at the same spot and in the same way as his son. But this was not the only founder lost to the field of honor. When we last saw Button Gwinnett in 1777, the challenge had been accepted. On the morning of May 16th, he and Lachlan McIntosh met near Savannah. They stood at 12 paces. They fired. As we know, both were struck. McIntosh in the leg, Gwinnett in the thigh. The seconds declared honor satisfied, and the two men, having demonstrated their courage, shook hands. But while McIntosh recovered, Gwinnett did not. The wound proved fatal, and he died 3 days later. His rival, General McIntosh, was charged with murder. Though he was ultimately acquitted, his reputation in Georgia had been ruined by the duel, and he was transferred, relocating north to serve at Valley Forge.